Welcome to this video for Lab 9. This lab will cover blood vessels. So blood vessels, this is our second lab related to the cardiovascular system, and you have learned about the heart and the major vessels that carry blood to and from the heart. This lab is going to continue that conversation as you learn to name the blood vessels that carry that blood to the rest of the body. Now, the naming of the blood vessels is not that difficult. Most of them are very familiar terms to you, as the blood vessels names are typically named for the region of the body to which they direct blood or the bone that they travel next to. Arteries and veins typically travel together and share the same name. So typically there's a brachial artery and a brachial vein. There's going to be a femoral artery and a femoral vein. There will be a few mismatched pairs, and you will also see that there are some additional veins in the body that don't have arterial pairs. The blood vessels are broken into two main groups: the systemic circulation. These are the blood vessels that bring blood to and from the body tissues, all the systems, and then there's additionally the pulmonary circuit, which brings blood to and from the lungs for the purpose of gas exchange. These two circulations, the systemic and the pulmonary, are working together to provide blood flow throughout the body. There are three main classes of blood vessels. These are both a difference in size, but also anatomy and function. To start off, there are the arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. There is no exception to this rule, always away. As arteries travel away from the heart, they're going to bifurcate, they're going to branch, they're going to become smaller and smaller. Eventually, those arteries will feed into microscopic vessels called capillaries. Capillaries are where the gas and the nutrient and water exchange happens between the cardiovascular system and the systemic system, whatever system we're in. From the capillaries, blood is going to return after it has delivered oxygen and water and nutrition. The blood will pick up waste products also at the capillaries and return that through a series of veins. Veins always, no exceptions, return blood back to the heart. As arteries move away from the heart, they get progressively smaller. As veins come back toward the heart, they will get progressively larger. There is a term in anatomy called an anastomosis. This term is basically wherever two things come together, and when two or more vessels merge to supply the same body region, that is referred to as an anastomosis. We'll see that there are far more anastomoses in veins than there are in arteries. Let's take a look at the anatomy of blood vessels. Blood vessels are tube-like structures, and there are layers or coats or coverings that make up these blood vessels, and these layers are called tunics. Three main tunics. The inside layer is the tunica intima. You'll also see the tunica interna. It is the innermost layer of the blood vessels, and this is simple squamous epithelium. This simple squamous epithelium is called more specifically the endothelium. And there's a little bit of areolar connective tissue that holds this layer together. The middle layer is the tunica media. It is the muscle layer. You know that this is smooth muscle. And you've been learning a little bit about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And when your blood pressure goes up, typically in a sympathetic response, that can cause vasoconstriction to some blood vessels, but at the same time, some blood vessels may experience vasodilation. So that is, when you are scared, your blood pressure may go up. That's going to require the narrowing of the blood vessels to drive the pressure up. But there will also be simultaneously other vessels that will vasodilate. That is, they're going to open up and reduce the blood flow to those regions. The outside layer of blood vessels is referred to as the tunica externa or the tunica adventitia. This outermost layer is areolar connective tissue. It has elastic and collagen fibers. It is the layer that is going to anchor the blood vessel to other tissues, to the wall of a chamber. And it's also in the tunica externa that one will find the vasa vasorum. Vasa vasorum literally means vessel of the vessels. And it turns out that the blood vessels themselves, think of them as small organs that require their own blood flow. The blood that is traveling through the blood vessels' purpose is to be sent to a distant place to deliver oxygen. But the blood vessel is itself made up of cells and must itself receive nutrients and oxygen and remove waste products. And that is the job of these smaller arterial blood supplies going to the vessel itself, called the vasa vasorum. Much of what I want you to do in these slides is to compare and contrast arteries versus veins. So in arteries, the middle layer, the tunica media, is the thickest layer. That's that muscle layer. In veins, it turns out that the tunica externa is the thicker or the thickest of the three layers. The lumen, the opening within an artery, is more narrow than that of a vein of the same size. So if you had the femoral artery passing right next to the femoral vein, you would notice that while the outside circumference of the vessels are essentially the same, if you were to cut into those vessels, you would notice that the lumen of the femoral artery is more narrow than the lumen of the femoral vein. Arteries, because they are maintaining a much higher pressure, also contain more elastin than veins. This makes sense. How do you feel someone's pulse? Right? When you feel in your wrist for the radial pulse, you're actually feeling the elasticity of the blood vessel opening and closing, right? With each heartbeat, with each pulse of blood through the artery. So it makes sense that arteries are very elastic. They can stretch and recoil back to their original shape. Another very important fact is that capillaries, those smallest vessels that allow for the exchange of nutrients, water, gases, waste products, and everything else, only are composed of a tunica intima. That is just a little bit of simple squamous epithelium with just enough basement membrane connective tissue to glue them all together. And that very fine layer is what allows for gas exchange. Remember, there are two places in the body where gas exchange occurs. One is in the lungs, in the alveoli, and as you know, that's composed of simple squamous epithelium. The second place where gas exchange occurs is in your tissues, when blood is brought to the body by capillaries, and there too gas exchange occurs, again, across a simple squamous epithelium. Looking at this visually, an artery on the left, a vein on the right. Let's pretend these are both the femoral artery, the femoral vein. Again, you see that the lumen is more narrow in the artery compared to the vein over here. The layers are on the inside, the tunica intima. Again, this is just that simple squamous epithelial layer with just a little bit of connective tissue holding it all together. There is, and again, that's called the endothelium. So the layer is called the tunica intima, which includes that simple squamous epithelium called the endothelium. There is the tunica media, again, significantly thicker here on the arterial side than on the much thinner venous side. And then the tunica externa, the outer layer, not very thick on the arterial side. It is thicker on the venous side. And notice the vasa vasorum. If you look here in the artist's rendition, you can see that there are arteries, small arteries and veins throughout that tunica externa. And those small arteries and veins are that vessel of the vessels, the vasa vasorum. So on the left we have the artery, on the right we have the vein, and then in the middle the capillary is shown. And the capillary is a more delicate vessel, and it is reminding us in the picture that it's composed only of that simple squamous epithelial layer called the endothelium with a little bit of basement membrane. And the colors tell us that as oxygenated blood enters into a capillary bed, things become kind of purplish as gas exchange occurs, and then that blood leaves through veins after it has dropped off oxygen and picked up CO2. Just a couple more facts about arteries. Typically, arteries carry oxygenated blood. That is, they carry red blood. Now, there is one exception to this, and that is in the pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. This blood leaving the right side of the heart is carrying deoxygenated or the blue blood. You've seen that in the heart. There are basically three kinds of arteries. The greatest arteries, the biggest arteries, are referred to as the elastic arteries. Elastic because they have the most elasticity. These are the vessels under the greatest pressure. Think aorta, think pulmonary trunk. They are receiving blood under quite a bit of pressure, and that requires elasticity of these great vessels. Then the medium-sized arteries are essentially the other named arteries that you are naming throughout the body. They have a little bit less elasticity. They are very muscular. They're designed to carry blood long distances and to withstand that high blood pressure. And they have, again, a substantial amount of muscle. The smallest arteries are called the arterioles. These are significantly smaller. They still have enough smooth muscle to maintain their structure and their integrity against the pressure. Interestingly, as an artery's diameter decreases, so as you go from the elastic to the muscular to the arterial, the amount of elastin decreases, but the actual relative amount of smooth muscle actually increases. The significance of this is your body makes changes at the microscopic level in the blood flow through the arterioles. And in order to make those changes in blood flow to constrict or to dilate, it requires smooth muscle to make those changes. So it's really the smooth muscles down in the arterioles that are going to make significant changes in how much blood is traveling to a particular muscle group or to a particular organ. Now, once that blood travels through the arterioles, it'll then branch off into capillaries. Again, these are a different type of vessel. They are the connectors, if you will, between the small arterioles and the smallest veins called venules. We'll see that in a moment. They're relatively small, very small. And recall that a red blood cell is about 7.5 microns from side to side. And these capillaries are only 8 to 10 microns thick. Remember, we saw how flexible red blood cells are back in Lab 2, and you learned about the hypo and hypertonicity and how red blood cells can expand or crenate. So you already know that red blood cells are rather flexible, and that flexibility is required for them to get through these relatively tight corridors called capillaries. Again, the capillaries are only made up of the tunica intima, that simple squamous endothelial layer. This allows for rapid gas and nutrient exchange. And because this is where all the real action happens within the cardiovascular system, the capillaries are considered the functional units of the cardiovascular system. We've seen that functional unit terminology before. You may recall that in compact bone, the functional unit was the osteon. Remember the osteon, the lamellae and the canaliculi and the structures that allow for bone to do its job. And then in muscle, remember the sarcomere, right? That sliding filament theory in the sarcomere unit. So these are, quote, the functional units of bone and muscle. You'll also see as we go through these diagrams that capillaries don't work independently. They usually work in groups, referred to as a capillary bed. So here is a very simplified capillary bed. Let's take a look here. So here is blood traveling in an arterial. In this particular rendition, the artist has left the endothelial layer intact for us to see, the inside layer, and has left the smooth muscle layer, right? So we're seeing the smooth muscles around the outside of the arterial. As this blood comes in, it is, quote, oxygenated in red. It's going to come in here. Notice that there are some smooth muscle cells that wrap around here at the beginning of that capillary bed. These form precapillary sphincters, little muscles that are going to wrap around. And this little branch, this little section that is the connector between the arterial and the capillary bed is called the metarterial. And these precapillary sphincters are going to regulate how much blood can come into this capillary bed. There is a lot of surface area here, and it's important that blood is traveling, taking turns, going through different capillary beds at any one time in your body. As the blood travels through the capillary bed, notice we see the color shift from red to purple to blue. We're losing oxygen, we're picking up CO2. Also within that capillary bed, water's being dropped off, CO2 is being picked up, nutrients are being dropped off, waste products are being picked up. As this blood now leaves the capillary bed, it's going to leave out and then travel in a small vein called a venule. Okay, these are the small veins. It's interesting, right? Small veins are not, you might think they'd be these, right? Venules or something. That's not correct. They are venules. Notice it's U-L-E, not O-L-E. Okay, so once the blood has traveled through the capillary bed, dropped off oxygen and nutrients and hormones, now that blood's going to return through veins. Veins are going to continue to return back toward the heart. As they come back, they're going to get larger and larger. Structurally, we already saw that the wall of a vein is much thinner. There's much less muscle involved. The lumen is larger. The pressure, therefore, is lower. So there's lower pressure in the veins. These veins are carrying deoxygenated blood. Again, the exception, and we saw this last week, the pulmonary veins that leave the lungs and come back to the left atrium are carrying oxygenated or red blood. Now, there is one other exception to this red and blue, and that is in the umbilical artery, in the umbilical vein. We'll see that in a few minutes. As I mentioned, the pressure is much, much lower in the veins. At any one time, your venous structures, your veins, hold about 60% of your body's blood. So it's not a 50-50 split between the arteries and the veins. The veins have about 60% of the overall blood flow. Now, the smallest veins are the venules. The venules then come back to the veins. Let's just call these the veins that you are labeling, right? Those medium-sized veins like the femoral vein and the brachial vein. And again, the blood pressure is very, very, very low in the veins. To prevent blood from flowing backwards, there are valves. These are primarily found in your lower extremities. And these valves are preventing backflow of this blood. Now, if these valves become faulty or leaky, this can lead to significant edema in the lower legs around the ankles. And so if you know someone who does a lot of standing, and these valves over time have become problematic, they may have very swollen ankles, swollen lower legs, and this is a sign of a vascular disease or a condition whereby the valves and the venous system is not as strong as it should be. That leads to varicose veins and things like that. So you might be asking, well, how is it then? How does blood come back to the heart? Right? We've got a lot of pressure. When the blood leaves the heart, it's pushed out with a lot of pressure by the left ventricle. And that pressure drops as it goes to the capillaries. And as I've said, the pressure is much, much lower in the veins. So how in the world is it that this blood comes back? Well, in addition to the valves along the way that prevent blood from moving backwards, there's also a good number of the veins that pass in between your skeletal muscle groups. So what this means is that as you move, as you walk, as you contract your muscles, veins are being squeezed. And this is also going to help push blood back up the legs, right? It's going to push blood back up, and these valves are going to prevent it from backflowing back toward the legs and calves. This muscle aided idea of pushing the blood through the veins is called the skeletal muscle pump. So here's just a review of arteries versus veins. Again, it gives you the three layers. It reminds you of the elastic, the muscular, and the smallest arterioles flowing into those delicate capillaries, back through venules, medium-sized veins, and then the large veins. For large veins, think vena cava, right? Think the superior and inferior vena cava. Notice the medium-sized veins have valves. What does this look like under the microscope? I mentioned already that veins and arteries tend to flow side by side in the body. What we're seeing here is an artery. Notice that it stays relatively round. It looks very muscular. We have a very significant tunica media, and you can see the blood vessels. You can see the blood there in the center of this. So you can see that there are blood cells inside the lumen. In the vein, notice that it's much, much larger. So the vein is much more distended. It is much less strong. It has a much weaker muscular layer, and it tends to stretch out, and as you can see, has a larger lumen. Hopefully you recognize that there's some muscle in this view as well. Here's some skeletal muscle over here. And one more thing that you've seen before. Here is a nerve. So here's a nerve. Remember we talked about nerves and fascicles of nerves. So this is all one big nerve here. And here are those fascicles that we see. And if we were zooming in, we would see the individual axons with those Schwann cells around the axons providing protection. And then out here, these are lymphatic vessels. Now, I wouldn't ask you to recognize this, but these are some lymphatic vessels. And then you also see a fair amount of fat and adipose in the view as well. Think about how far you've come with your histology, right? The fact that you're recognizing these different structures within this image. Here's a close-up view of the histology. Again, you can really see, I like the way that this is labeled with the layers. You can really see that both the vein on the left and the artery on the right, they both have the tunica intima. But what is most dramatic is the tunica media. So you can see that the artery has this much, much, much thicker, substantial layer of muscle, whereas in the vein, it's a very, very, very thin-walled vessel. And then they both have the tunica adventitia. So much of your lab will be learning to recognize and identify a number of these arteries and veins. So last week you saw how blood leaves the left ventricle and goes into the aorta. What you probably didn't notice is that as soon as blood goes through that aortic semilunar valve and into the ascending aorta, there are branches off to the sides, the left and the right coronary arteries. Now these coronary arteries are going to go around and bring blood to the heart muscle. Last week you learned, or you'll see again this week, the circumflex artery, the marginal artery, that are part of the branches of those coronary arteries. Then, as the blood continues, it's going to go up into the aortic arch. And off the aortic arch, there are three main branches. The first is the brachiocephalic trunk. And it tells us that this blood is going to go to the brachium and to the cephalic, right? It's going to go to the arm and the head. And we'll see that the brachiocephalic trunk, just like any tree trunk, will split into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery going to the arm. The second major branch off the aortic arch is the left common carotid. It goes straight up the left side of the head and neck. And then finally, the third major branch off the aortic arch is the left subclavian artery going off to the left arm. So we see that not only is the heart asymmetric, so are the blood vessels that are carrying blood to the rest of our body. We saw last week how asymmetric the lymphatic vessels are as well. Then, after the aortic arch, there is the descending aorta. Now, this is going to travel through the rest of the thoracic cavity, pierce through the diaphragm, continue down into the abdominal pelvic cavity, and is going to eventually branch off to all of the viscera of the abdominal region. And then we'll take a major branch. It'll split into the left and right iliac arteries. Those left and right iliac arteries will then split into the internal and external iliac arteries. This slide is not really useful for you to study from, but it is a reminder that you'll be taking a very close look at the major highways of the arterial flow through your body. Now keep in mind what we are learning in this course. If you think about it like being the U.S. highway system, these are the major interstates, right? And off every major interstate, there are exits that go off to major roads, and those roads go off onto streets, and those streets go into neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods go into small side alleys and cul-de-sacs, and everybody's house is connected somehow to a street. Think of that flow, right? That the nutrients are being delivered down the highway, getting off at exits, going down smaller streets, and eventually getting delivered to you. Think of your house as being a cell, right? Where nutrients need to be delivered and waste products, garbage, need to be let out. So that in the same way, what we are learning in this arterial map is really just the major highways. We are by no means learning the small streets and the branches that go into each and every cell of your body. In your body alone, you have about 100,000 miles of capillaries. That should give you a sense of awe as to how marvelous this system is. But about 100,000 miles of capillaries responsible for bringing oxygen, blood, water, nutrients, and everything else to all of the cells of your body. So you'll be learning the major arteries of the body. Likewise, you'll be learning the major veins of the body. And as we've already said, blood is going to return in veins, typically by the name shared by the artery. And veins inferior to the diaphragm, coming up from the lower limbs, the pelvis, the peritoneum, the abdominal structures are going to go into the inferior vena cava, and you know that merges into the right atrium. There are veins that are going to drain blood back from the head, the neck, and the upper limbs. They are going to eventually merge into the superior vena cava. And recall, we learned that there is a coronary sinus, and the coronary sinus is going to drain blood back from the heart muscle itself, also into the right atrium. So that's a good review from last week. Again, you'll be learning those major veins of the body. Again, major trucking routes. We're not learning the microscopic structures or the small venules that carry that blood back, but eventually that blood drains back into these greater veins, which then all merge, as I said, into those vena cava. You will see that there are additional veins. There are more veins, I should say, than there are arteries. And you're going to see this specifically in a couple of places. You're going to note that in the arm, there is a basilic vein, and there's a median cubital vein, and there is a cephalic vein. These are three veins that do not have an arterial sibling. Okay. Also, in the leg, there's the great saphenous vein. So there's also a small saphenous vein, but those are the major veins that you'll be seeing that don't have an arterial sibling of similar name. Just let me highlight just a couple of things. Again, you'll be learning these different blood vessels, and also there's a table in your lab folder asking you to learn what artery carries oxygen to particular muscles or to particular organs. Now, this is not as clean cut as it is with nerves, right? We know, for example, that the axillary nerve brings electrical signal to the deltoid muscle, for example. In the vascular system, there's a little bit more of a variation and a lot more sharing of the responsibilities, but there are some pretty clear-cut examples, and I've included those in your folder for you to identify. For example, a couple of easy ones, right? The renal artery, the left renal artery, brings blood to the left kidney. The right renal artery brings blood to the right kidney. Some of this will make sense. The splenic artery, right? The splenic artery is going to bring blood to the spleen. So some of these will make great sense. You'll be learning also that, for example, the inferior and superior mesenteric arteries bring blood to different regions of the digestive system. Blood flow to the brain. Again, when you start looking at the smaller vessels, there's a lot more to this, but the major vessels that bring blood up to the brain are the vertebral arteries left and right. You've already seen the vertebral arteries. Recall, these are the arteries that travel up through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra, and that's shown here in this diagram. The other major blood flow to the brain is coming up off the aortic arch in the common carotid artery, left and right. That common carotid artery is going to branch into the internal and external carotid arteries. The external carotid artery goes to the side of the head, but to the brain itself, the internal carotid arteries, left and right, are carrying most of the blood. So really what you have is you have the vertebral artery bringing blood up, and you have the internal carotid artery bringing blood up. And that blood is then, of course, going to branch into smaller and smaller vessels. Now, those vessels all have names, but that's as far as we are going to carry this conversation. Just think, major highways going to the brain include the internal carotid artery, left and right, and the vertebral artery, left and right. Then the blood that comes back from the brain is coming back through the vertebral vein. Again, there's a nice combination pair, right? A sibling pair of vertebral artery, vertebral vein. But here's one of those exceptions. There are no carotid veins. The blood flow comes back from the brain through the jugular veins. Okay, so this is one of those mismatches of carotid versus jugular. There are no jugular arteries. There are no carotid veins. A couple other really cool things to talk about, and we'll be done with this presentation, is the liver and what's referred to as the hepatic portal system. Have you ever thought about where do all those nutrients go that you absorb into your intestines? Well, those nutrients don't just drop into the bloodstream and go circulating around your body. Before your body sends out nutrients, those nutrients are sent first to the liver. The liver, as you'll see in a moment, is going to receive those nutrients through a series of veins. This is the hepatic portal system. The liver is then going to process, detoxify, check out those nutrients. Make sure there's nothing in there that's harmful to you. If there are, the liver is going to try to destroy it. There are a bunch of macrophages and cells in the liver that can destroy potentially harmful things, but there's also detoxifying mechanisms in the liver. And then once that blood has been checked out, the nutrients have been checked out, then that blood leaves the liver through hepatic veins and travels and merges into the inferior vena cava. So you'll see this as we look at this couple series of veins. The other thing that the hepatic portal system is doing is receiving red blood cell recycling from the spleen. Recall from the lymphatic presentation that the spleen is breaking down and recycling red blood cells. So let's take a look at what this looks like visually. So as nutrients are absorbed into your intestines, right, those nutrients are absorbed into a series of veins. These veins are all going to merge, here we go, merging up and into the liver. So this major vein is the hepatic portal vein. The liver is then going to detoxify and check out that blood, and then out of the hepatic veins, left and right, this blood is then going to leave, having been checked out with the nutrients, and drain into the inferior vena cava, right? And that's going to go up to the heart, and now those nutrients will be part of the circulation as it travels through the body. Then lastly, fetal circulation. We saw in the heart last week a few structures, and let me highlight the significance of those as we think about how is it that a fetus gets its circulation. An important fact to know is that fetal lungs are not developed or able to respire until at least week 25. And while the fetus is in the amniotic sac, in utero, the lungs are surrounded by fluid. And so it's not until birth and the umbilical cord is cut and the fluid is removed from around the lungs that the lungs themselves are able to receive blood and to reoxygenate the blood. So how in the world then does a fetus get its oxygen supply? And the key is the placenta. It's the placenta that is actually the organ for gas exchange for a fetus. So let's take a look at how this works in a big picture idea. So here is the placenta, right? It would be down here at the bottom. And so the mother is sending through the placenta, through the umbilical cord, right? Blood, and this blood is going toward the baby's heart. So because it's going toward the baby's heart, this is a vein, right? This is the umbilical vein. Now this is that backwards example, if you will, color-wise. The naming of the umbilical vein and the umbilical artery are based upon the baby's anatomy. So because the blood is traveling toward the baby's heart, it's a vein, but it's carrying red blood. So this is a red-blue example switch, right, like the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. That blood is going to travel into the inferior vena cava of the baby and enter into the baby's right heart, just like it would in you and me. But remember, the baby's lungs aren't working. So it makes no sense for the right ventricle to pump blood to the lungs. That would be a waste of time and energy. Those lungs are not doing any gas exchange. And so there's an opening between the right and left atrium. And that opening is the foramen ovale. Now you know that the foramen ovale after birth closes to become the fossa ovalis. So in the adult heart, in the interatrial septum, in the wall between the right and the left atrium, there's an indentation about sort of an oval-shaped quarter size, nickel size, and that is the fossa ovalis. But in the baby, in the fetal heart, there's an opening, the foramen ovale. So that means that blood is going to go, red blood is going to go directly from the right side right over to the left side. And that blood is then going to be pumped up through, down to the left ventricle, and then up through the aorta, just like you would expect. Okay. But there's also a couple other shortcuts that I'll describe here in a second. So that blood is then going to travel through the baby's body, delivering oxygen, and then that blood is going to leave and come back to the mother through the umbilical arteries. Again, these are going to be blue arteries that are carrying deoxygenated blood back to the mother for gas exchange. So there are three things that are happening here. Number one, that deoxygenated blood is diverted from the pulmonary artery. So there is some blood going up into the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, and going to the baby's lungs, but most of that is also going to be diverted through this structure called the ductus arteriosus. So that blood is going to be shunted up here. So what are these three shortcuts? Okay, so number one, the ductus venosus, that's a structure here that is going to bypass the hepatic circulation. There's that foramen ovale that I mentioned here that is going to bring blood from the right atrium over to the left atrium. And finally, there's the ductus arteriosus, which is going to connect the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. Again, bypassing those non-functional lungs. And you may have seen in the heart structures the ligamentum arteriosum. That duct becomes a ligamental connector. So that's just a quick thinking about how the fetal circulation is different before birth, and once birth occurs, those shunts, the foramen ovale closes down, the ductus arteriosus becomes the ligamentus arteriosum, and the ductus venosum also becomes a ligamental structure in the liver.